Online debate is a once-off cooperation between the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Institute of Security Studies. And I'm mentioning this because the ISS is an institutional partner of our sister foundation, the Hans Seidel Stiftung, who normally has the privilege to work with this prestigious think tank, the ISS. Today on the panel, we have two great experts on the matter. First, I would like to introduce to you Eleanor Powell. She is an international expert in the security and societal and governance implications generated by the convergence of artificial intelligence with other dual-use technologies, including cybersecurity, genomics, and genome editing. Eleanor provides expertise to the World Bank, the United Nations, and the Global Center on Cooperative Security in New York. She also works closely with governments and private sector actors on AI cyber prevention, the changing nature of conflict, foresight, and global security. Furthermore, I would like to present to you Karen Allen from the ISS. Karen joined the ISS in June 2019 as a senior research advisor in the office of the executive director in Pretoria.
Du directeur exécutif à Pretoria, en Afrique du Sud. Depuis 15 ans, Karen a travaillé comme correspondant de la BBC à Nairobi et puis à Johannesburg.
Interest in the relationship between terrorism and global justice, technology, and human security. The session today is moderated by my colleague, Ms. Andreas Ostheimer, who is not only heading the CAS United Nations Liaison Office in New York, but she is also one of the most distinguished CAS experts on African politics and development politics. So we really hope with this event that we can reach out to people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and thanks to technology, this is possible. But before I hand over to Andrea, I would briefly say some online house rules. First, a disclaimer. Data protection and privacy is important to us. So I would like to point out that this event will be recorded, or well, it already gets recorded. And if anyone disagrees, you have to drop out now. And I really hope that our panelists don't get a second thought on this. But okay, the second thing I would like to point out to is the Q&A section. We have no chat box, but please feel free to drop comments and questions in the Q&A section. We will try to consider as many questions as we can. Thirdly, I would like to inform you that the publication on this topic will be available free for download. And after the event, we will send every one of the participants a link to the recording of this webinar and also to the publication. And please feel free to share. And when you're interested in our work, please do not hesitate to visit the website of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation or the Institute of Security Studies. Last but not least, for our French-speaking friends, we have a translation. Il y a une traduction en français. Vous pouvez suivre la discussion française sur une deuxième chaîne. Il y a un bouton en bas à droite. I would like to thank our panelists for being with us today, the ISS for partnering on this special occasion, and of course, my colleague in New York, Andrea Ostheimer. Considering that we celebrate in only 4 days the International Women's Day, I shall stop here and hand over to Andrea to lead this all-female discussion of today. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Henning, for your kind introductory words, and also for this cooperation between CAS South Africa, ISS, and the Office of CAS at the United Nations in New York. In fact, together with Eleanor Powell, we have undertaken over the last 18 months this in-depth research on the impact of artificial intelligence and digital technologies on the electoral cycle. And our reasoning has been that elections are key elements of any democracy. They have to be free and fair. Citizens are supposed to have a free choice, and political parties should encounter a level playing field. But we also ask ourselves, what do these minimal standards still mean in the age of artificial intelligence and ICT?
Artificielle et d'éthique. Eh bien, pour défendre la démocratie, nous avons identifié 2 lignes d'attaque. Premièrement, l'espace politique.
Where candidates and parties are campaigning, seeking popular support, and where online defamation, hate speech, data leaks, disinformation, and also deepfakes can alternate the level playing field. It is this level, the capturing of the hearts and minds of citizens, that will be at the center also of Eleanor's input today. But we also have the technical space where particularly electoral management bodies, the electoral commissions, are the most vulnerable institutions. It is a sphere where data manipulation by local or foreign actors can disrupt an electoral process, and where also competing political parties need to have sufficient expertise on technologies in order to understand and to prevent any electoral fraud. The results of this second study you can find also on the website of CAS New York for download. And as Henning mentioned, we will send out to all participants links to the respective publications after our seminar. At the time of our research, Carr and Ellen investigated two phenomena that are closely linked to ours: digital vigilantism and biometric surveillance. So I think it's a great opportunity to bring together today these two angles, and special thanks to both of you, Karen and Eleanor, for sharing your insights with us in today's discussion. And I would suggest perhaps that we start off with that you are giving our audience a short oversight of the three most worrying trends that you have identified in your research. Perhaps you can do it briefly, 5 to 7 minutes, and then I would like to embark on the discussion. And perhaps, Eleanor, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you so much, Henning, for your introduction. I'm going to share some slides just because I have great maps that I want to show you. So if you can tell me if they're on, yeah, that seems like it's working. So good morning. It's a pleasure to be sharing insights with all of you today. One of the most significant legacies of the global crisis we face will be the way that the pandemic dovetails with another major global disruption, the convergence and democratization of powerful dual-use technologies. And across countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a proliferation of dual-use technologies driven by economic and national security interests is creating new opportunities, but also new threats that fall outside legacy policies. And in this context, information disorders have erupted as new powerful vectors to interfere in elections, undermining citizens' political agency. And as a result, governments, private sector, and civil society actors must learn to manage this risk as quickly as algorithms learn to manipulate everyday life patterns. But it remains unclear how to do so and how to succeed. And this is what learning to live with dual use entails, with implications from securing elections and populations' data integrity to imposing norms in cyberspace. And so the essence of my remarks today and the threats I want to highlight will focus on two questions that populations in sub-Saharan Africa will face in their aspirations to political agency and human security. So first, how can we map how and why new forms of behavioral surveillance and data manipulation are leading to information disorders, undermining electoral and democratic processes? So in other words, how and why information disorders contaminate elections in Africa, eroding citizens' trust in governing institutions. And second, what is the wider geopolitical threats and story behind the exploitation of information disorders in elections across Africa? How is a tech power like China not only using Africa as a surveillance testing ground, but also as a strategic positioning to dominate in converging technologies? So let me jump in and start with what I call the Internet of Bodies and Minds. The fact that converging technologies lead to a new paradigm of behavioral surveillance. And within African societies, the combination of biometrics and AI with facial and affect recognition is starting to amplify massive data capture and behavioral analysis about populations. And in this context, I should underline that China's model of algorithmic surveillance is progressively imported to sub-Saharan Africa. So examples of technologies that make bodies and minds increasingly traceable are countless. It's the AI software called iSentry used to detect abnormal behavior in the streets of Johannesburg, mobile biometric devices deployed by Uganda police force that use AI to confirm a match on the spot, facial and behavioral recognition used in Zimbabwe to predict the movements of crowds in public spaces, to an arsenal of tools for monitoring social media for computer interference, mobile device hacking, and IMSI catchers, making every cell phone a living brain. So controlling populations, digital bodies and minds is the ultimate postmodern form of biopolitics. It can be used for disrupting elections and securing state power. Now, when studying the impact of information disorders on elections, we tend to underestimate how the convergence of AI with pervasive biometrics and facial recognition leads to new forms of political, social, and behavioral manipulation, with the potential to restrict a political agency. And so 4 powerful technological and political trends tends to contribute to the proliferation of information disorders in African elections. The first trend is the increasing capacity and willingness of some members of governments to exploit digital networks for inflaming existing racial, social, and economic divisions between subpopulations. And in the African countries where privacy and data protection policies are not translated into robust operational mechanisms, state and private sector actors can extract sensitive personal data from an array of online population databases for targeting ethnic and socioeconomic groups. Data collections from social media networks, SIM card, civic and voter databases can increasingly be used by authorities for populations profiling and targeting. So literally taking the pulse of the electorate. And as you see on maps 3 and 4, SIM card and voter identification systems are starting to use biometrics. These platforms can provide precise insights into a person's ethnic background, political affiliation, education level, wealth, location, and mobile phone number. And for instance, Kenyan expert Robert Muturi explains how in 2017, prior to the election, voters' demographic information was connected by political parties to social media profiles and mobile phone numbers to achieve more precise targeting within personal networks. Now, the second trend concerns the capacity to automate ethnic profiling in countries that are still suffering from violence outbreaks related to ethnic divisions. So relying on the aggressive campaigns produced by PR companies like Cambridge Analytica or the SCL Group, domestic political parties can exploit citizens' personal profiles and information networks for spreading rumors, targeted propaganda, hate speech, mis- and disinformation. And for instance, political campaigns in 2017 in Kenya and in Nigeria in 2015 relied on video propaganda that built on ethnic and socioeconomic tensions to target segments of the electorate defined by ethnicity, political leanings, and age. And such operations used automated mass texting on WhatsApp and on private networks as tools for targeted outreach and incubators for disinformation. And the rationale behind such sophisticated disinformation architecture is to immerse citizens in an alternative virtual reality where they themselves become producers of emotional manipulation. And interestingly, this tactic muddies who is supposed to carry the burden of intent behind spreading malicious content, and it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for social media companies to rely on rules that prohibit inauthentic speech. So this is what I call the anatomy of information disorders. And as a third trend, the tools of behavioral surveillance can be harnessed for both fueling information disorders in elections, but also silencing civil society and media groups that could offer resistance. And so rising concerns for populations are new forms of closing the virtual civic space. The last trend pertains to an array of new AI and cyber techniques that can seriously undermine trust in the electoral cycle. And you have to remember that elections are complex, vulnerable, data-driven processes, right? So new threats include first what we call information risks. So cyber attacks they've already targeted populations' sensitive information by compromising the integrity of data in biometrics ID systems, civil and voter registries, electoral systems, political campaigns, government and hospital databases. The ease of such attacks also comes from the fact that in the last decade, millions of voters across the globe have had their personal information leaked publicly or sold in the underground economy. Other threats can target human vulnerabilities, in particular during pre-election political campaigns. So the combination of psychometrics manipulation tools with personal data sets can lead to powerful emotion targeting tactics that will not always be detected as malicious. The use of deep learning could also enhance cyber intrusion by reproducing someone's biometrics for authentication, or producing deepfake audio and video to impersonate a trusted contact. So in such a way, electoral and political campaign staff could be manipulated to leak crucial information. And therefore, across African nations, the convergence of AI and data capture technologies could be increasingly harnessed by state and non-state actors for manipulating a population's behaviors in elections, as well as for power and resource capture. So to come to a close, let's look at the wider geopolitical story behind information disorders. And increasingly,
sorry, Eleanor, can we leave this for later on? Because you are beyond your 7 minutes, and I also would like to give the floor to Karen.
Sure.
I think you have already identified the three kind of emerging threats that are most worrying: data exploitation, manufacturing and spreading of emotion wars, and cyber AI attacks before and during elections. Certainly trends that are also cross-cutting with the kind of threats Karen has identified. And I would like to give the floor now briefly to
Karen.
Karen.
Donc, si vous le permettez, je donne la parole à Karen. Pour vous, Karen, quelles sont les principales tendances, les plus préoccupantes en tout cas, qui sortent de votre étude?
Eleanor for a long time because I find her research absolutely fascinating. So I think you'll find that quite a lot of our ideas converge on this. Just very quickly, by way of definitions, when the two areas that we were looking at were biometric surveillance and digital vigilantism, just really quickly, by biometric surveillance, we mean centralized biometric databases by governments for the purposes of registering life events. So births, marriages, deaths, and it's increasingly be used as a means of accessing government services, such as welfare grants, by identifying people based on their DNA, fingerprint, iris, voice, etc. And these basically help to confirm identity. Another area of biometric surveillance is data which is acquired through the proliferation of CCTV cameras, public space CCTV cameras, which capture our image and our face, how we walk, our gait, with some predictive measures built into that. When we talk about digital vigilantism, which was the second piece of research, we were looking at how data can be used on social media to amplify messages or points of view beyond that which they might otherwise enjoy in the real world. And that nods a little bit towards the point that Eleanor was making about social engineering, and by using deep learning to be able to replicate some of those biases. So for me, what are the three most worrying trends? Well, first of all, what we observed was the potential of what one might call data tools to influence or suppress or sort members of society according to algorithms or built-in biases. In Uganda, for instance, we saw how the internet was shut down during elections recently, as of course Uganda's not alone in doing that, but it seems to be a response to a government which recognizes the reach of messages on social media and challenged the status quo. We've seen the same in Ethiopia, and we've seen centralized government databases separately having the potential, if not fully audited, to be abused, to target those not just in election time, but the rest of the time or the rest of the electoral cycle, or the rest of the democratic cycle, I should say, that those databases could be abused to target those deemed to be undesirable to society. So, for example, LGBTQI groups in Uganda have expressed concerns of their data being centrally held and how it may increase their vulnerability. Another example, in Kenya, the Huduma number centralized biometric data system, when fully up and running, would actually enable police officers to identify criminal elements and track their footsteps. Now, the main purpose of this centralized biometric data system is to access government services, but we do see the possibility with it being located within Kenya's security architecture, where auditing is extremely hard, for that to be used for the purposes of being able to identify criminal and terrorist networks by the state. We've also seen that centralized biometric databases have the potential to exclude members of society, for example, foreign nationals in South Africa, who may not have the exact requirement for an automated system to be able to access a service. And our work on digital vigilantism showed how data tools such as social media using powerful algorithms can amplify messages to exclude or to demonize particular segments of the population, calls to action, for example, against them. In South Africa, we observe this given the example of xenophobia. And of course, that can have real world consequences. The second observation was the lack of regulation or enforcement, public awareness regarding the potency of data and the safeguards. We just don't realize how much data is being collected and how important it is in terms of being able to shape our lives. We have laws on data protection, the Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa and data protection laws 2019 in Kenya, and they include basic international data protection principles. But the big question for me is about enforcement. At the time when we were doing our research, there was no independent authority in Kenya to oversee the implementation of the new regulations. In South Africa, a new information regulator is still settling into her role, and it's only now recruiting staff, although the Protection of Personal Information Act, POPIA, was passed back in 2013. If I tell you in terms of CCTV footage, and private video surveillance equipment, there is a huge market for this in South Africa in particular, but providers are not required to register with the city council. And there are no regulations about where these data gathering devices, the CCTV cameras, can actually be erected. In terms of social media and digital vigilantism, very, very little regulation of self-proclaimed digital vigilantes. They're able to operate at the margins of acceptability and avoid effectively being kicked off social media, whilst enabling other social media users who reshare some of their rhetoric to become unwitting foot soldiers spreading hate speech. And that's because of the power of algorithms which are built into these systems. My third final area where I want to flag up concerns is function creep and what we call it a sort of data arms race and the establishment of new surveillance norms. For me, function creep really is one of the biggest dangers. And what that means is when data gets used for purposes, for other purposes than for which it was originally intended. There are 8 international principles of data privacy, which Kenya and South Africa have signed up to. And that includes how data is acquired, how it's stored, prohibitions against its being used again. And in conflict settings or peri-conflict settings, for example, in parts of Kenya where there have been terrorist threats, there are concerns that databases are used as a counter-terrorism tool. And this is an example of function creep. The securitization of these databases, again, another example of function creep. I said that the Huduma number system is firmly entrenched as part of Kenya's national security strategy. And by being interlinked to other databases, it may assist on the one hand in cutting down on things like terrorist financing. But again, I would advocate that the lack of oversight and accountability by virtue of the fact that it's been securitized presents an issue. Facial recognition technology, we also know, has been good for cutting down on identity theft. We're seeing it used, facial recognition and facial verification technology being used particularly in the banking sector and other financial areas in South Africa. But we've seen how it's been misappropriated by the police in other settings, for example, during the George Floyd protests in the United States to identify so-called troublemakers. And as part of this, I just briefly nod towards this idea of an arms race in surveillance technology. China, the United States, Israel, France, UK are all competing to be the main supplier of such technologies in the African continent. As well as importing the technology, one arguably is seeing countries importing the surveillance norms that reflect a state's particular position. Much has been written about a company called Hikvision. It's one of the main suppliers of biometric surveillance products in South Africa, also in Kenya. And it found itself sanctioned in the US for its technology being used to suppress Uyghur Muslims in China. There are a concern that if you have a dominance of players in the market with a very, very different surveillance norm or a set of surveillance norms to the host country, that over time, those norms may eventually change. And there is a greater acceptance that as sentient human beings, being surveyed will become a part of natural everyday life.
Thank you, Karen, for these kind of worrying insights into your research results. As I have cut short Eleanor before when she was about to start on the geopolitical implications, and you also just mentioned actually the kind of prevalence of Chinese surveillance technology. I would like to pose to both of you before we enter and open the discussion to our participants. I would like to pose the question whether we can identify the dominance of China in the biometric surveillance market, and can we also say already that after having mortgaged the natural resources in Africa, now we are observing a new sellout of African citizen data? I don't know, Eleanor, would you like to continue where I had cut you short?
Sure. So this space of biometric surveillance is certainly a space where China is active with the Laxton Group. It's still in competition, though, with other actors that are pretty efficient also in that space, coming from Europe and from the US. But what I see as a more interesting, bigger picture than just the issue of biometrics is really this issue of converging technologies. So what we see is that China seeks both a systematic and long-term engagement to legitimize its normative influence, to build and control the future roads of cyberspace, and use Africa as a geostrategic positioning. So what you see happening is that China's long game is to control enough territorial, maritime, and economic corridors to achieve two goals: become the first tech provider to oversee not only inland critical infrastructure such as AI data centers, smart cities, satellites, clouds, and e-commerce platform, but also the web of fiber optic cables that will power 5G networks and a substantial part of the global internet. And African nations provide strategic positioning not only for building access to 5G and cloud technology, but also for capturing populations, biometrics, but also biological data, and then energy and mineral resources. And so you have to understand that getting access to such data, it's genomics, biological, health, behavioral, you can add the biometrics to it, but that means having a very particular insight into how societies behave, what they need in terms of future market priorities, what they need for health. And so how you can really, to some extent become the provider of all those needs that I think should be considered almost part of national security agenda that are related to health, to biosurveillance, and to forms of value chain. So it's really a race towards which tech power is going to be able to control access to converging technologies and master dominance in converging technologies. That's how I see this space, and I would really think that genomics, biological data, health data is the sweet spot that a power like China is looking into.
Thank you, Eleanor. Karen, you just mentioned there is this arms race in surveillance technology, and when it comes to China, is it still a level playing field, or has China already gained an upper hand in that?
China's already gained an upper hand. I was speaking to an American diplomat long ago who wanted to start a conversation about 5G technology and sort of turning the tide here. And I said, perhaps that conversation should have been had about 5-10 years ago, because China's here and it's here to stay. And it's provided a lot of the infrastructure that underpins some of the technology that's coming on stream now. I think there's realpolitik and I think there's Chinese motivation that need to be seen as two separate things. The realpolitik is that China provides technology cheaper. It makes it extremely attractive to many of the users of the technology, including, say for example, companies that are trying to be ethical in their procurement and that are using, for example, CCTV cameras. They're using Chinese technology, which they assure me that they are trying to scrub for bugs to make sure that they are not feeding data straight back to Shanghai, as we've seen in other instances in the past on this continent. But I think, the reality is that a lot of the big players in this market are from China. There are concerns about being able to audit some of the algorithms that they have, about the security norms that come with that. But as Eleanor also said, acquisition of data, I think, is also a huge issue. We take Zimbabwe, for example, which has done deals with a company called CloudWalk, facial recognition technology in Zimbabwe, to provide the kits, the hardware to be able to acquire this data. And there are now questions about who owns that data. Is China trying to effectively harvest vast amounts of data, which can not only be monetized, but also can be reshaped and packaged back and sold back to the continent, and can also, again, reinforce some of the surveillance norms that I've talked about. So I think there are huge areas of concerns. I don't think China is the only player that we should be concerned about in this result, but the fact that they are so vast and that they've ahead of the game, they've signed the main contracts they're providing the smart cities in South Africa, which is a large part of the country's sort of 4IR, the Fourth Industrial Relations Initiative, is something that certainly should be getting alarm bells worried. That doesn't mean that they don't get the contracts, but I think awkward and difficult questions need to be asked about what are the drivers and what are the safeguards that need to be put in place.
Thanks. Actually, you just mentioned monetization, and there's one question from the audience who's actually asking, to what extent is the data collected monetized? What does it mean? And for example, if a company exchanges data for a political campaign, is this exchange equivalent also that being paid? Do you have any idea about the range of profits also private companies are making in selling such data?
I think it's difficult to actually put a figure on it, but the very fact that there are some companies that have made a living of scraping data from Facebook and then selling it as a commodity gives some indication that there is money to be made in this sphere. I can't give you numbers. It wasn't the focus of our research, but I think, clearly the value of data and the amount of data that we're now able to accumulate and use it for a variety of different purposes just gives you some, people are describing it as the new oil, gives you some indication because of its application over such a wide variety of sort of political and commercial spheres. It's a valuable commodity, but I can't give you the accounts of those companies and tell you what deals were done. Perhaps another research project should be looking at that.
Yeah, Eleanor, I know you have looked specifically also into the implication of Oxford Analytica on the continent. Did you gain more kind of empirical statistics data on that?
So it's Cambridge Analytica, and the SCL group. And while those companies are not active in their, in their original forms, definitely the teams working there are still in the data analytics business. So what we could see there is that such companies don't just work as PR operations for political parties. They also commodify and monetize data that are linked to sanitation, that are linked to water and energy projects, that are linked to education, to how youth is being militarized in different countries across Africa. So that's what you would call, a form of a data exfiltration or data commodification for security purpose. What I think we don't necessarily understand in this picture is also this notion of behavioral surveillance. If you start to really understand how the next generation is living, buying, moving, what their aspiration and needs are in the commercial space, but then also in the education space, you can privatize a lot of different types of services and industries based on really watching how the next generation and the older too, but I think there is really a sweet spot there, how to understand, how they behave. Now, the medical space is really where you will see a rush for Africa, because the population is going to double by 2050. Those of course are general numbers, but the needs in terms of health are going to change drastically. It's going to be a lot of diseases, comorbidities that we are suffering from in the West, but that will be increasingly being amplified there. It's cancer, it's other type of a disease for which if you have access to genomics data of population, you can understand literally not only what kind of medical products to provide, but also how to push almost how to be the pusher of populations that would become healthcare addict to an international power, to a foreign power. And so I think we don't understand well enough how health systems and the bioeconomy in general, but should be part of, to some extent, the national security agenda, or at least should be better understood, and foresight should be applied to that domain.
Yeah, thank you. We have one question related to the level of threat awareness. To what degree do African parliaments, civil society raise questions about these practices and relationships with tech providers? And can we see a kind of a concern, a pushback amongst also the kind of most important stakeholders?
I can take that one. I would say that increasingly there is a rising awareness of those kind of threats, but what we lack is a clear understanding of how complex those hybrid threats are, and then a lack of foresight and policy leadership. So why is it so difficult to understand and map this new security space? Because you are facing hybrid threats. So they are multifaceted, they are complex, they are cross-converging technologies, and some of those global technology supply chains include outsourcing. So it's a difficult space to map. You're talking about behavioral surveillance, emotion targeting, synthetic data, potentially adversarial AI against different type of infrastructure. And so the targets are also changing. It's not just physical targets and population security, it's also security of their data, security of the electoral infrastructure in terms of information risks. So that's why you're really facing different types of threshold, different types of actors, different types of targets, and the threats are also evolving. So that speaks to the lack of understanding, the lack of foresight and policy leadership. I think that's where, if we're thinking a little bit about solutions here, where the UN and the African Union could play a role in normative leadership, which is really needed at the international level. And it's really try to understand how to help negotiate adequate normative frameworks for population data protection, privacy, and digital rights. Support also normative foresight. What do I mean by normative foresight? I mean to better implement data protection mechanisms which are tailored to African countries' challenges. So where you really understand how to translate ethical and policy aspirations into robust operational mechanisms that will function in a situated context. And then we absolutely need also to have more strategic monitoring and crisis planning capacities. The problem is that, as I was saying, the actors are really hybrid and different. So how do you create the incentives and the capacity building to include the private sector, eventually academia and civil society actors into that form of preparedness? If you look, for example, at another technology sector, which is the gene synthesis screening or the biotech space, there is really an effort to build capacity, to build incentives, and to scale up a system where companies can become part of screening because they don't have to start, their policy learning curve from scratch. There is incentives and help there. So I think we need to look at different technological domains and see what has been successful in some of those complex spaces and try to really think about that. There is also a lack of definition of what we call dual use. What kind of activities should be of concern? How do we define that in terms of technology, so that we can think about standards, certification, levels of preparedness to work with, when you think about a specific societal context and a specific way a country is thinking about its technological architecture.
Thank you, Eleanor. Karen, you have focused particularly on South Africa and Kenya. What kind of level of awareness did you encounter there? Particularly also looking into, and you mentioned it, the lack of regulation, the insufficient quality, perhaps of the kind of law or legal frameworks, and the lack of capacity in the enforcement, the law enforcement part. What kind of awareness and also the kind of response do we see?
Thank you. I think we see that there's been quite a lot of activity. Both South Africa and Kenya have got fairly energetic civil societies, which means that there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of debate, but it's very difficult to actually convert that into action. We have seen legislation, and I've made reference to it, data protection legislation and cybersecurity legislation, and one has to realize that there is an overlap between the two areas, both in Kenya and in South Africa. And one of the biggest challenges has been the enforcement power that goes with it, but also the prioritization. And I think that's a key thing to bear in mind, is that we're talking about parts of the world where there are huge other priorities, and trying to start policymakers and lawmakers thinking of the threats that may not quite be there yet, whilst at the same time dealing with the clear and present dangers, not least because we're talking about COVID at the moment. It makes it quite a difficult sell. But nevertheless, I think we have seen some examples of a public calling out of, say, for example, some of the big social media platforms. So when we think of the digital vigilantism space, and we think about sort of those platforms and social media platforms and their ability to propagate messages or to intrude on people's privacy, we have seen literally in the past few days, the new information regulator, for example, in South Africa, very publicly calling out Facebook about new rules of engagement, new privacy standards for WhatsApp. Facebook also owns WhatsApp, and making the point that there seems to be a different burden of privacy or a different threshold for what's considered norms in privacy in the African continent compared to Europe. It's a small example, but I want to just emphasize that there is awareness here, and there's a lot of potential expertise, but a lot of it is siloed expertise, and a lot of it is about being able to get the resources.
Par silo. Et donc, c'est très difficile également d'avoir des ressources pour pouvoir traduire cette législation en des actions concrètes. Alors, la législation dont je parle est une législation nouvelle. Il faut bien sûr que ça fasse l'objet de règlements supplémentaires. Et par ailleurs, nous n'avons pas non plus
all the time to be able to develop those. You know, again, both Kenya and South Africa, huge technological hubs, a lot of innovation, but it's channeled largely into the commercial sphere rather than into the regulatory sphere. And I think that is something that speaks to the fact that people are thinking about how they're able to enjoy and to use tech now, and not necessarily thinking about the threats around the corner.
Yeah, very important point. And you rightly mentioned the siloed expertise, which is actually an elite expertise. And one of our listeners asked actually the question, having this discussion in an African context where you have the very vast rural-urban divide, how is it actually possible also to bring along citizens, to make citizens aware of the threats that are implicated in having their biometrical data, for example, used? And how do we also bring the citizen out of this catch-22 situation? Because if I want to have access to basic services, I might have to give away my biometric data.
Yeah. For me, it's a public information campaign. I mean, I think because, you know, it's not rocket science, because the tech is developing so quickly. You can have all the regulations in the world, but ultimately, if I have a mobile phone in which I'm about to surrender some personal data, I need to know as a holder of that mobile phone what I'm doing. And that's where I really do think grassroots awareness is an important element. I mean, that also contributes to the idea of pushback. And if you can only get access to certain services by surrendering your biometric data to a centralized database, well, perhaps there are opportunities for campaigns to be built, raising awareness about that, and a conversation, particularly within, say, a South African framework, as to whether that is acceptable or not, or whether there are opt-outs. So I think a lot of it is about public awareness, because I think the speed with which the technology is being developed is always going to be faster than the pace of bureaucracy and the pace of government response. And so I think we are already seeing, just to give you an example, 1 or 2 embassies, I won't name them, but in this part of the world, are sponsoring digital awareness, digitization projects in the rural areas, so that people at the very least are aware of the dangers of giving away, either the dangers of clicking on a link that could take them to a site which then steals their data, or the danger, or just good, healthy cybersecurity in the broadest possible sense. And that, of course, you know, crosses over into the issue of data.
Yeah, and Andrea, I was going to say, you know, in some of the interviews I conducted, there was also this notion that there is a need for developing more specific, in-depth expertise in cybersecurity, but to some extent there is a reluctance from some of the some actors in power to also see that expertise developing at a pace where it's difficult to control, you know, what the indirect implication could be of it. So you have, you know, that's really clearly a problem of reframing the incentives. Something we have, I mean, something I'm a big proponent of, and I see that in the biotech and in the research space. You have actually in Africa and in Europe, in the US, it's a global movement. People who learn how to code, who learn how to do biotech research at a simple level, but then, you know, incrementally more complicated, who learn about their own disease, about how to be active in those spaces. And so that's called, you know, democratized innovation. There is actually, I have a few colleagues that are looking at such projects in Africa. There is a huge demand and interest in becoming, you know, your own agent of empowerment in your society, leading that kind of research. In Europe, you have those kind of sharing labs that exist. They are not small-scale things. I mean, they have, you know, a lot of funding. They do AI, biotech. They work on COVID-19 project. It's extremely interesting. They do ethical research at the same time. It's all the next generation of European researchers, but it's also starting in Africa, and it could be developed. It could be sponsored. It could be funded so that you give an alternative to you know, a surveillance capitalism or a behavioral surveillance from a foreign tech power. So the empowerment has to be about knowledge creation and about giving opportunities, you know, to gain that knowledge and apply it, and think about other norms and other ways of, you know, of using the digital powers of the future. It doesn't have to be behavioral surveillance and a panopticon. It could be serving local needs and could be much more versatile. And that's where the UN, you know, international organizations have a role to play. The World Bank, including too. I mean, how do we spur that knowledge society model? Not just, you know, in Europe, it's working slowly, it's getting there. How do we do that also in Africa and create collaborations? Because those, you know, those groups are actually highly collaborative. And in the time of pandemic, I mean, that's what we need to be thinking about. So instead of fear to develop expertise from elites, how do we break that model for
Exactly.
local democratization?
Yeah, thanks. One of our listeners raises the issue of dual-use technology and the sensitivity around it. And most of the technologies is imported by African countries, but are exporters, are those countries where the technology comes from, are they prepared for the lack of oversight regulation in the destination countries? And if we bring it a level up on the international level, what kind of regulated frameworks do we need in order to prevent the kind of abuse of particularly dual-use technology?
Yeah, I can start on that. You see those converging technologies are really conceived, designed, and deployed through global supply chains. There is a lot of outsourcing of different aspects about how you build, either a specific AI application for surveillance or how you build, a biotech pipeline. What's interesting here is that as the supply chains, as the technological conception is decentralized, the responsibility is also atomized. So it's extremely difficult when you think about the misuse of civilian technologies into the security space. How do we reaffirm responsibility, accountability, remediability, all of those aspiration, normative aspiration? How do we make them concrete? I don't know if regulation, if a ban, a moratorium, or that level of normative action is what we should think about, because there is always a catch-up game there. But what could be more interesting is working really with the private sector on certification, on standards, trying to inject some maturity and responsibility in this space by thinking about how we define dual use, how we define functional activities in AI that will be dual use. What is of concern? Is it, that kind of data predation? Is it using it without, I don't know, the right policy safeguards? We need a work of a really better understanding what we mean by dual use, how we define it, how we translate it into normative practices, and maybe a more agile space is to do that at the level of soft regulation, of standards and capacity building for screening, accountability screening, human rights impact assessment. But you need someone to sponsor, to chaperone that effort. And to some extent, you need to give incentives, right? So there is an interest of buying ethical tech, right? How do we create that form of incentive?
Karen, would you like
Yeah,
to?
I have to agree with Eleanor. I think it's got to come from the private sector, because many of the technologies, the dual-use technologies, emanate and are designed by the private sector, whereas the old-style technologies, the old-style surveillance technologies were largely developed and held by militaries, and then subsequently gained sometimes civilian applications. I have to say, I don't think outright bans work, and I think regulating it is problematic. I think there has to be a system of certification, and there has to be a way of making ethical tech sexy, to be honest, in the same way that people might buy free trade. That I think the difficulty is that when you've got such a range of different suppliers, but also I'm back to surveillance norms, what's acceptable among the providers and what is not. And until there is a kind of global standard, and there are at UN level, there are conversations which are being had about sort of responsible behavior in cyberspace, which also includes a lot of this technology. They can't come up with a definition of what is sort of ethical use. So my feeling is that it has to be largely down to the individual providers, and there has to be a way of being able to make it a selling point, and a selling point not only to the supplier, but also to the person on whom that's going to have an impact. So if you're selling CCTV cameras, for example, that could be used to track, could be used by the police, for example, to track certain people in society without oversight, would you want those same cameras being lodged in your local residential areas to look out for car crime? There needs to be a way of being able to separate those two things out in the minds of the consumer and make that an incentive for the private sector. And by the way, the private sector say to us in South Africa that we have the knowledge, we have the expertise to build a lot of the capacity that's needed in the public sector. But because it's very siloed, it's very, very difficult to find entry points. If you have a look at the, just take an analogy in terms of security, providing, say, cybersecurity, the banking sector has come together to develop sort of minimum standards to protect customers and to protect themselves from intrusions that would jeopardize their business. There's an argument for something similar for the mobile phone sector, for various other sectors that have a similar shared understanding of what the primary function of this technology should be, and develop standards according to it.
Thanks. Eleanor, you are working also closely with the UN, and you are also following those expert groups, the open-ended working group as the governmental or intergovernmental expert group. Can you sense a kind of an appetite on global level to create such a global standard that is much needed? Or will it, like Karen said, be in the end down to the private sector and the individual providers to bring in ethical standards?
Thank you, Andrea. That's a really complex question and complex space. I see more tensions between, different perspectives, thinking about, either the private sector, civil society, or states. Certainly, civil society has been at the forefront of understanding how new threats, hybrid threats, are targeting different vulnerable groups. So they have knowledge, expertise, and they have, really showed effort to try to think about norms, normative leadership. How does it look like in this new space? So there is a vibrant, vibrant communities thinking about that in the civil society sector. The private sector, it's really fragmented. I mean, some companies are models of thinking about some potential norms. They're also, at the forefront of thinking about how civilian infrastructure can be new targets. You have, I don't need to necessarily name groups. I mean, you have the Cyber Peace Institute. Microsoft has been extremely dynamic in trying to think about, how normative models could be adapted. So you also have companies that are really, doing early warning awareness and threats monitoring that are part of those groups that provide extremely important insights. Now, in terms of this, at the state level, I mean, there are enormous tensions about who get a say in how we define the cyber sovereignty model of the future. So, the architecture was based on an open, evolving model with a lot of trust built into the system. This model is progressively, being undermined and more fragile. On the other hand, you have countries that are leaders in thinking about cyber sovereignty as a national security model, where you keep ownership of your data. You don't necessarily promote global data transfer and sharing, even on complex topics like cybercrime or pandemics. So which model is gonna win most supporters in an international arena? That's definitely something we need to look at. Transparency, global data sharing, thinking about responsible behavior norms, all of that has to be defended and promoted by, probably by the UN at this point, and not necessarily left to one of those groups. But I would say there is support in some extent in the private sector, certainly in civil society, and then we need to figure out how to negotiate you know, those type of collaboration with the support of willing member states.
Thank you. One of our first and my last question to you is actually a very complex one, and we could have another seminar around it, but nevertheless, I want to pose it. Our participant asked whether the increased reliance and also the use of the internet is not threatening, particularly the fragile democracies in Africa. And would it not mean as well, and when I was reading, Karen, your study on digital vigilantism, I was asking myself as well, to what extent might we have to move out of the anonymity of social media in order to get a grip on phenomena like digital vigilantism?
I think it's impossible to wriggle out of the anonymity, because I think what happens is that you will then have a displacement. So people will move from platforms like Twitter or like Facebook to anonymous platforms like 8chan and all these other platforms that I'm sure many people who are watching this webinar will know far more about than me. I think it's, you know, there is an element that anonymity sells. I think there are certain circumstances when that anonymity is blown, and I think there is, you know, effort and an understanding now among some of the social media companies that they cannot be internet neutral, that they are players in a very, very complex space. And I think what we also have the sort of flip side of that is that with some of the digital vigilantism work that we did, which was looking at the mechanics of digital vigilantism as opposed to who the actual players are, it's not very hard to unearth who these actors are, and often they want their identities to be known in some vague sort of way. So I think, you know, I think the issue of an anonymity isn't necessarily the key issue. For me, one of the key issues is speed and kind of algorithmic propensity, ability and amplification of messages. So the disconnect between someone standing on a soapbox in Hyde Park in London, for example, making a political argument, or singling out someone in a particular community and calling on people to go and hammer down their doors. It's very, very different to someone going on one of the social media platforms and starting off a conversation about person X, person Y, possibly putting their personal identifiable information into the public domain, which then, by the way, makes them vulnerable to cyber attacks and for that data to be stolen. But the amplification effect of social media is such that, you know, the one voice that would normally be standing on an orange box in Hyde Park and have maybe an audience of 12 has the most extraordinary opportunity to address simultaneously in real time large numbers of people and turn them into foot soldiers to propel a particular message, whether that's a positive message or it's a negative message. For me, that's a much, much more salient question, as opposed to the identity of the people behind the networks on social media, because there are other tools that we're able to use now, open source tools that help us identify who they are and to take action accordingly.
Are we undermining successively our democracies?
By having more speech on social platforms?
No, by these kind of phenomena, yeah.
I mean, there are also, you know, obvious opportunities, and I was talking about the democratized innovation. You also see how those technologies are literally changing, you know, how innovative we can be and how we can learn. I mean, that's really something that I keep saying. If you want to learn about how to treat disease in the future, you need these technologies. We cannot make that choice. What's terrible to me, it's that we are driving without lights, and so it's not one tech fix, you know, about anonymity or another issue that will help us here. It's really thinking about a theory of no harm, responsible innovation. How do we incarnate that notion of responsibility into the innovation ethos? And in terms of, I think there is also something that the private sector could do with bright minds, in international organization or sponsored by them or supported by them. It's really do better foresight and then intent and capacity assessment, trying to understand in advance how specific actors can be harmful to vulnerable groups, how and why, and how does it function, and have a better understanding of that. And then we can probably advance on the preparedness side, but also keep the vibrant opportunities that come in terms of knowledge building and knowledge sharing. That's really living with dual use. I mean, how do we do that?
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we have very interesting questions and comments that we can't address in 1 hour, unfortunately. But I think today's discussion has highlighted once again that we have to increase the understanding for this very complex, or the complexity associated with those cross-cutting and cross-converging technologies, and that we really have to break out of the silos and really work hand in hand, government, state actors, non-state actors, in order to create also the kind of knowledge transfer. And evidently, as is in the case in the African context, also to try to bridge this digital divide in societies and to bring along citizens. And not to have these kind of reflections centered amongst the elite. So I would like to thank both of you for the input you have given today, but also the kind of in-depth research that you are undertaking on a very complex, difficult matter, which is increasingly important for our societies. And thanks for sharing those insights. And to all participants, thanks for tuning in today. We wanted to have it short and sweet, this discussion. And certainly, I think the topic merits to have follow-ups, and we keep you posted. Thank you. Have a nice day.